We all have all sorts of traditions and rituals in life. What do some of yours look like? Maybe they're daily or weekly or monthly or on an annual basis. Those things that we keep coming back to, those touch points in life that are familiar and have some level of meaning to us. They span the spectrum from incredibly simple with little meaning to incredibly deep and something that's touching and moving in our lives. Some of the simple ones might revolve around that morning cup of coffee. For me, that start to the day when I get to make that first cup of coffee and have that first hot sip, it's just a special moment. I'm often thinking about it as I go to bed at night, that next morning when I get to start the day with that fresh little sip. Speaking of which, just a minute. It might be something really simple, like, do you happen to, every time you get in your car, readjust the rear view mirror, even though you were the last one to drive it, right? There's things that we just do on a continual basis. And then there's some that are incredibly meaningful. I remember when our kids were young, we would take time on Christmas morning. Maybe we'd open up stockings, and then we'd sit together, the kids on our lap, and we'd read the birth narrative together in a book that was at their age level. And that was this beautiful tradition. I remember every year, there's just a special moment as we sat together and we read on those mornings. We all have traditions. We all have rituals. And built into Israel were a number of traditions and rituals, touchstones on their annual calendars, touchstones in their lives in which they could be drawn back in to the continued story of what God was doing in them and in the world. One of those touchstones, one of those celebrations was called Passover. And Passover remembered something from the past. It remembered Exodus. In our Bibles, that second book, we find the story of Exodus, the story of God redeeming his people, the story of God rescuing his people up out of Egypt. And I won't go into much of the backstory, but I will briefly describe this Exodus event because it's central to what we'll be talking about today. In Exodus, they remembered with unleavened bread the rushed escape. In the middle of the night, they hurried out. Didn't have time for the bread to rise, but instead they would hurry out. In their Passover meals, they would drink wine together, and in between each of the elements, songs were sung that drew them back into the story and the narrative of what God had done for their people. And lamb was eaten. And lamb was central to both the Passover event in the Exodus and the Passover meal that Israelite peoples would share together. Now, this is a little bit gory, but I'll go ahead and share with you the significance of it. You see, under a cruel power in Egypt, Israel had been subjected to all sorts of torture and punishment and struggle. One of which, when in the time a man named Moses was born, was that Egypt was executing all male children at birth or after birth to prevent the population from growing larger. So the end of these 10 plagues that God had brought to redeem his people up out of Egypt, the final was that of the Egyptian households, the firstborn male would die in every household. That is a plague that would wipe out the firstborn male in every house in Egypt. And it was going to be devastating. It was going to be harsh. Without going into a ton of the backstory, Egypt had 9 opportunities to release God's people and to move out of this prior to this event. And yet it would be tragic, and there's no questioning that. So the way the Israelite people would be passed over, the way they would be not subjected to this final plague, was that the evening before Passover, they were to slaughter a lamb and then cook it and eat it as a family. And they were to take a portion of the blood of the lamb and paint it over their doorposts, and this would be the sign that this is the people of God. The lamb, the blood of the lamb would be what saves and protects the firstborn, that would protect their household. And so it came to be. And each year, then, Israel would come back together and they would share in this meal. And they would eat lamb and they would remember that God has saved our people, that God did not subject us to the punishment, but instead redeemed us up out of Egypt and brought us to a promised land. And so Jesus, on the night before he would be arrested, is sitting at Passover with his closest followers. They're sitting around a table and they're remembering God who has been faithful, a God who saves his people, a God who redeems his people. And Jesus would take and go far off the script of Sabbath. You see, at this point, Sabbath was very well established, Passover was very well established. There was a ritual to it, and they would go through that. But Jesus was about to go off script, and in a way that would change the life of the church and us for the rest of time. You see, Jesus would take the bread and take the wine that was at the table, and he would assign somewhat of a new meaning, and yet actually a continuation, an explanation of what Passover was for the people. You see, Exodus was a paradigmatic tale. It was a paradigm that described for humanity, that demonstrated for humanity the way in which God would save his people. Through the blood of a lamb. God would redeem his people out and give them a promised land. And now Jesus, coming full circle, begins at this Passover meal to describe who he was and the significance of what he was about to do. God was saving his people again, and this time through Jesus. And so while sitting at the table with his closest followers, he took the bread that was there, and he said, "Take this bread in remembrance of me. As you break it, remember, this is my body. And take this wine or this grape juice, it is my blood." In Luke chapter 22, verse 19, he took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them. "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." Jesus describes new hope, a God who is continuing to save and redeem his people. He takes and reassigns the idea of a lamb, a Passover lamb, salvation through the blood of that lamb, a God who redeems his people and leads them to new hope and to new life and to a new place. And he says, that happens through me. I am the new Passover lamb. And so he invited his apostles to each time they gathered together and broke bread and drank wine, that they would remember Jesus, his body and his blood. The salvation and the hope would be at the center of their gatherings as they shared a meal together. And so, in fact, the practice of communion, or it's called a number of other things, Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, has been a practice since then. We read in the book of Acts, as the church had begun to develop and to grow in Acts chapter 2:42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking bread, and the prayers. We have in this text the story of the church gathering in homes, gathering around a table together, and at those gatherings to share often a full meal, and in that meal to break that bread and to remember Jesus and his sacrifice, to drink of that fruit of the vine and to remember Jesus and his sacrifice. This communion, this Eucharist, this meal shared together was far more significant and far more radical than many of us would recognize as surface value. It was, in fact, a shocking statement around social justice and what it is to be the church, because, you see, the wealthy and the poor would sit around a single table and share a meal, something that wouldn't normally happen in society in that time. Slaves and slave owners would sit around a table and share a meal, and somehow try to imagine how in Jesus, in his sacrifice, there might be unity, there might be invitation, that we might commune together even from our very different places in life. And though communion invites us to realize a beautiful invitation to unity, it also has been a challenge throughout the story of the church. You see, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul is responding to the division and the difficulty that has come around communion, this meal in the church. You see, what he speaks plainly against is the fact that, in fact, people were being left out and oppressed by this very meal that was intended to bring us together. It was having the exact opposite effect that it was intended for, because the wealthy would gather early in the evening and they would eat and drink in excess, but then once the slaves or those of less means or those working extra jobs would get off work, they would come and find the food gone and find themselves once again uninvited to the table, to the fellowship. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, as he writes to the church in Corinth, "So then, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat, for when you are eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers. As a result, one person remains hungry and another gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? Certainly not in this matter." He clarifies for us a number of things. First of all, he's dealing with a very particular situation in that church and in that time, but it reveals to us a number of truths about communion, about this meal that we share on a weekly basis. It reveals to us that there's something sacred and special taking place, and that to take it flippantly or to ignore its relevance or to allow it to become actually a point of division as opposed to one that draws people together would be completely contrary and unpraiseworthy. It says that in communion we are invited to share in something beautiful together, and where division exists, in communion we are invited to come together. And so that a description of the first century church and both the practice of communion and the challenges that surrounded it grew into a history of the church participating in, sharing in this communion meal. Now, throughout history, the theology and the understanding around communion has developed. It's been different amongst different denominations and different peoples in the Christian community. And I want to take a moment today as we really highlight and focus on this communion meal that we'll share in at the end to talk a little bit about that theology and the way that it's developed in some ways. Communion has also been called the Lord's Supper and Eucharist throughout church history. And in communion, we understand this idea of communing together. It has a twofold understanding. It means a couple of things. First of all, there's the communion between us and God, that in communion we recognize and realize, we remember Jesus' sacrifice and recognize God and his continued work. It is a time in which we connect personally on a spiritual level with God. It's also a time that we connect with each other. It's a time in which in community we get to share in this belief that Jesus' sacrifice brings hope and life, and that he rose again from the dead as well. The church throughout history has understood the actual elements, the bread and the wine or the grape juice, in a number of different ways. A theological term, a technical term that I'll mention, transubstantiation. This is the belief, particularly or beginning in the Catholic Church. It is a doctrine that that during Eucharist, the substance of the bread and the wine completely is transformed into the body and the blood of Christ, though they retain their physical appearance, taste, and smell. So that the bread and the wine become the body and the blood of Christ. And this has been believed by many in the Catholic Church throughout history. On the other hand, following Luther and the Protestant church, the evangelical church, many have come to believe the bread and the wine to be just symbols of, right? A representation of Jesus' body and his blood. That's the sort of tradition that I grew up in and had come to understand communion in. However, there's a middle position that I really resonate with and that I want to propose today as we move towards our time of communion, of sharing in this meal together. It's called consubstantiation. It is the idea that Christ is present, that Christ is with the bread and the wine, and Christ is with us when the Lord's Supper is celebrated together. It heightens our imagination. It invites us to realize a God who has come near and who is coming near. A God that is present as we remember in bread and wine, Jesus, his body and his blood, that Christ is present amongst us in that place. In all of this, whatever you adhere to as far as how you understand those particular elements, I really appreciate the way the Eastern Orthodox Church talks about Lord's Supper or Eucharist. They speak of it as one of the mysteries, which I think is a beautiful word to imagine what is taking place as we share in this meal together. The mystery, it is a sacred event with a hidden and divine reality that cannot be fully comprehended, but is revealed and experienced through faith. I think that's beautiful language around what we participate in baptism or in communion. And whereas there are different emphases placed on these things amongst different denominations and church and throughout history, we get to lean into this idea that it is also a mystery. It is beautiful, it is deep, it is divine, it is in some way beyond us and unknown, and yet we get to live into it, experience it through faith. Here at the Vine, we practice communion in a number of different ways, and let me go into a few of the details and the ways that we participate and the reasons that we participate in those ways. In some churches, in some denominations, closed communion is practiced. That is only after confirmation or as a standing member of the church, and only after the elements have been blessed and administered by particularly the priest or the clergy. Then those that are invited to would be allowed to take communion. On the other hand, we practice, and many churches and denominations, more open communion, that anyone that would like to participate in this remembrance, in this ceremony, in this time, would be welcome to do so. We invite at the Vine, we invite families to share in communion together, meaning that children are invited to participate in it as well. Now, what we recognize is that in doing it this way, we risk losing some of the sacredness of it. And that's not the desire. That's not the goal at all. We do want to highlight the beautiful, deep, divine experience that communion is. There's something beautiful about milestones and invitations to next levels. So I certainly understand why many denominations and churches would practice it in different ways, that only at a certain age or only after confirmation would you be allowed then to participate in this thing. It could, in theory, build in anticipation towards this next step and this next level. That's beautiful. Don't discount that at all. On the other hand, at the Vine, we've chosen a posture in which belonging comes first, that together we walk in this journey of faith towards deeper faith. Every one of us is on it, myself included, that I walk in community, further realizing who God is and what he's doing in this world, further realizing what it is to be a person of faith and to walk in the ways of Jesus in this world. And so in that, we practice rhythms of faith even as faith is being developed. In a similar way then, in communion, we invite people to practice this rhythm of faith as faith is being developed. And to that end, some families have come to us and said that on weeks that we have communion available here at the center during the worship service, it's been one of the deepest and richest experiences they've had as a family in faith to stand in a little circle and to just share in that bread and that grape juice together. So, for those reasons, we practice open communion. Our goal is in no way to cheapen the experience. We desire to remember that Christ is present amongst us as we practice the sacrament, as we practice this rhythm of faith. In communion, we are drawn into a global fellowship. Not only is there diversity amongst us, and the communion that we share together speaks to equality amongst us, but in fact, Christians throughout the world on Sunday are gathering and breaking bread, and we are invited into this global movement that is the church, and to remember equity and opportunity and Jesus' invitation and hope and salvation that is found in him. Further, in communion, we're drawn into a historical story in which for thousands of years now, church members have come together and broken bread and drank through the vine and remembered Jesus and his sacrifice, and therefore we are reminded of a deep and rich history of which we are now a part, the people that believe in Jesus and have found our hope in him. At the Vine, we offer communion in different ways on different weeks. One of the reasons for that is we desire to honor the different traditions and backgrounds that we all come from and that our leadership teams have come from and have held dear to them, dear to each of us in our lives. And so we practice it in different ways. Communion is practiced weekly and available during the song service on some weeks, and often at the end of service, we'll highlight communion. Primary reason for that is that in allowing communion to be the final moment of our gathering, we're reminded that Christ at the center is most important. It's not about a performance or even the words that myself or someone else would say on a Sunday morning. That Christ at the center of this gathering is what is most central, most important to what we do as we gather together. So quite often we'll highlight communion at the end of our service. And at times when we highlight communion at the end, we'll invite people to come forward and to receive communion from another. In fact, today that's the way we'll be sharing in communion together. There'll be 4 people up front here holding bread and grape juice, and we get to receive it from another, remembering on even a deeper level that this is a together thing. Yes, it's a vertical thing between us and God. And yes, also, it's a thing between us. Traditionally, when communion's offered in this way, a priest or whoever is offering it on that day would say something along the lines of his body broken for you, or his blood poured out for you as you walk up and receive those elements. Here we often like to change this language to the plural. His body broken for us, his blood poured out for us. Again, remembering the connection between and the equality, the level playing field upon which we come and approach this table. We remember Jesus and his sacrifice. And so today, you are invited, if you would like to share in communion with us. Now, if that's uncomfortable, if on this day or in this season you would prefer not to, you are not in any way required to. But we do want you to know that you are invited if you would like to share in communion with us this morning. In communion, we remember Jesus' body and his blood. We remember his willingness to sacrifice, and that in him we might find new life. If those who would like to serve communion with us today, that are planning to serve communion today, would come forward and meet us up front here. The way it'll work in just a minute after I close, after I pray, is that we'll come up the middle aisle. We'll come and receive communion, and then you can head back to your seats on the outer aisles. In communion, we remember Jesus there at Passover, just before he would be arrested. We remember him sitting with his disciples saying, "This bread has significance. This is my body that will be broken for you, for humanity. This is my blood that is poured out for many." So today, if you would choose to, if you would like to, you're invited to share in communion with us, to remember Jesus, his love and his sacrifice, and the hope that is found in him. Let's pray, and then you are invited to the table. God, thank you for the day, for an opportunity to be together and to share in this. Jesus, we thank you for your love and your sacrifice, and pray that you would reveal to us your presence in this time as we share in this meal. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. And so this morning, we have been reminded by Christ's presence among us. And I'll remind us as we go from this place that he walks with us, that we are invited to walk in step with and sync with the creator of this world, a God who lovingly created and desires to walk with us. That Jesus will go with us from this place, that the Spirit is present in our lives in the week to come. Thank you for sharing in this time together. Pray you have a blessed week. Look forward to seeing you again soon.